We go. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to see a very full room this afternoon for our joint seminar with the Archives and Societies seminar, Digital History and Archives and Societies seminars together, looking at two projects that were part of the AHRC Big Data projects that are linked, ChartEx and Traces Through Time. And these two have 5 speakers this afternoon, looking two from then, someone who was involved with both of the projects. And I will do an overall introduction to all of the speakers, but rather briefly, because really what you want to hear is about these various projects and how successful they've both been. And to begin, we're going to have 3 parts. In the first part, Sarah Rees-Jones and Helen Petrie, who were involved at the ChartEx project from the University of York, are going to introduce that project and explain some of the steps that they've succeeded in that. And they will do that in 2 parts, in 2 presentations there. Sarah Rees-Jones is a very well-known historian, written a number of books, including most recently, I believe, one on the history of York.
That's right.
And Helen is a computing scientist specialist, I believe.
Human-computer interaction.
Human and computer interaction, that one in a second. But not an historian, anyways.
No.
And then we're going to move on after about 20 minutes or so. Thereabouts, we're not going to be absolutely fixed on that, but might need to move you on if we're going over, to look at the Trace Through Time project, which was run largely out of the National Archives, and Sonia, Ranade, I hope I pronounced that right, and Emma Bayne are going to explain more on the technical side, I believe that, because it was very much developing a not so much a user tool shortly in the second project, but looking at the developing the computer side of it and making it available to be able to search individuals through large, big data sets. And then finally, Roger Evans from the University of Brighton is going to talk about the data mining elements, the natural language processing, the data mining elements that were involved in both of these projects. And we look forward to that. Okay, I'll pass over now to Sarah. Sorry, Sarah, just one last thing before I do. Please hold off your questions to the end, and we'll do group questions at the end. As you are probably aware, we are recording this. We won't keep the questions on the recorded side of that, but just be aware that we are, 1, recording it, and 2, broadcasting live. The live broadcast will carry through into the question period as well. So if you are giving a question, please speak loudly so that those listening online can hear as well. Thank you very much. Over to you, Sarah.
Lovely. Thank you very much. It's very nice to be back here again. And just to emphasize that I'm a historian, so I'm going to give you a very simple introduction to the ChartEx project from a historian's perspective. So the ChartEx project, how am I going to move this on? What do I, sorry, the arrows.
It's just slow.
Is it just slow?
Just that slow?
It's a computer.
Don't tell me it's that slow. Please don't tell me it's that slow. It is that slow.
Okay.
No.
Let's try again. Oh, jeez. That's not good. Why are you doing this? They've given us the worst laptop in the building. Yeah, come on. Dare I do an escape?
I like to use mine up.
I hope we don't want to do that, because now it's...
Shall I pretend to be away? It might be easier.
We may end up having to... Let's just... Okay, I think
Just leave it.
Brilliant. We'll just leave it like that. Sarah, and it seems to go back and forth again. Sorry about that.
Okay.
If not,
Right. So yes, the ChartEx project was funded under the Digging into Data Challenge and ran from 2012 to 2013. So it's now a piece of history in its own right. And as you know, the Digging into Data Challenge was an international collaboration which was trying to develop new research infrastructure. And I think the team of us that came together on ChartEx, maybe I try, I've got the circle of death.
just
Okay, I think we skipped a slide, but anyway, the team of us that came together on ChartEx were from,
shall I try?
no, don't worry, it was from 6 universities in North America and Europe. And in terms of the scientific spread, we were from 4 different sciences. So there was quite a large group of medievalists, historians, specialists in natural language processing. We've got Roger Evans here, a group doing data mining in the Netherlands, who are not represented here today, and then Helen Petrie leading a team in human-computer interaction. Fingers crossed.
Yes.
Yes. The particular data that we were working with were collections of medieval charters, that is sort of title deeds, records that record transactions of property from, broadly speaking, the 12th through to the 16th centuries. We're not working with photographs of the original charters, but charters that have been transcribed into machine-readable text in a variety of formats, and that was part of the challenge. Really, was to test the methodologies we developed on different formats. So in some, the text was quite raw and unprocessed. In others, such as the data that we got from the National Archives, it had essentially been put into a spreadsheet and some metadata provided already. Some of the texts were in Latin, others were in English, others were in a mixture of those 2 languages, and that posed considerable challenges, which is something that Roger may or may not mention later on. The other bit of background to the project was my background as a historian who was interested in urban topography, the history of human settlement in towns, and particularly done a lot of work on York, using these charters to reconstruct patterns of ownership and occupation and to study how they change through time. So it was a very specialist kind of network analysis, if you like, with a very strong spatial element to it. So if you're looking at that map, the pink map in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide there, working out who lived in or owned every plot of land and who their neighbours were and how those relationships changed over time. And that's, for a historian, a very powerful tool of understanding cumulatively small changes in the urban environment which add up to a big economic and social story. So the challenge in the ChartEx project was to try and extract that kind of data from the raw sources, from the machine-readable text of the charters automatically, without heavily annotating or marking up the texts, and training the machine essentially to read the English or the Latin of the texts, to identify the core entities, and then to establish the relationships between them. So here you have what became our charter that appears in every ChartEx presentation. Just to give you an example of what one of these documents looks like, it's a grant by Thomas, son of Jose, goldsmith and citizen of York, to his younger son Jeremy of half his land, lying in length from Petergate at the churchyard of St. Peter to houses of the prebend of Ampleforth, and in breadth from Stonegate to land which Simon de Evesham inhabited, paying Thomas and his heirs a penny or a pair of white gloves at Christmas, etc. So you can see that in these texts there are quite rich spatial narratives of the spatial relationships between people occupying or owning neighbouring plots of land in the landscape, and also historical relationships. Thomas is the son of Jose, and he's passing the property on to his own son, Jeremy. I haven't even got the circle of death at this point, so trying to move on.
It was going so well.
It was going really well, wasn't it? Yes.
Come on.
Let's skip one. So, in the interest of moving on, I hope that what you can see here and what the next slide would have showed you is what we were essentially looking at is trying to sequence two kinds of information from these charters. We were trying to sequence the spatial relationships between people and other entities described in the charters. Does that make sense to you? And we were also trying to sequence the chronological relationships between people in particular. So you have at least 3 generations here. So you've got a kind of chronological relationship over 3 generations. And in pre-ChartEx days, I think I'm going to abandon PowerPoint at this stage. We would have, mapped that conceptually using tracing paper and squares to represent the different plots of land and how they related to each other spatially and chronologically over time. I am going to try and get the slide up of the ChartEx architecture because that's quite crucial for today, really.
Here we go. Why is it jumped?
Oh, okay. Well, if I can just go on one.
It's just being slow.
There
There we
you
go.
go.
Thank you.
So I think in the interest of brevity, this is the last slide I'll try and use. I won't therefore show you the results because I think that's going to take us too long this afternoon, but they're here if we want to get back to them later. So essentially an architecture was designed for the project where we started off with our machine readable text, our charter documents. And the idea was that the historians would then develop an ontology that the natural language processing group could use to train their software to recognize entities in each individual charter. So remember, the historians are not marking up systematically in all these charters who are the people, where are the places. They're providing a set of rules by which processing can recognize those entities, can recognize the relevant vocabulary and semantic patterns in the language of those charters that would enable the NLP to mark up each charter automatically. Once the NLP had marked up those entities of people in each individual charter, then the idea was that those sets of automatically annotated charters would be handed over to a data mining module. And in the data mining, the team in the Netherlands developed the algorithms in order to work out which entities related to each other. Which Thomas, son of Jose in Charter 408, was he the same person as Thomas, son of Jose mentioned in Charter 408 or Charter 453? And if I'd been able to get the PowerPoint to work, I would have shown you some of the statistical reasoning on which that was based. And so it was quite an ambitious project to run over 18 months, but by the end of that 18 months or so, the natural language processing, we did have some slides here to show it, was picking out some of the core entities, core people and places fairly systematically. Particularly in mind was that the data mining had then calculated the algorithm sufficient matching and sequencing them chronologically, but it was also sequencing groups of people spatially from the charters. So it was beginning to be able to say this group of charters and this group of people relate to number 1, Stonegate, and this group of charters and that group of people relate to numbers 2 and 3, Stonegate. Those patterns were just beginning to emerge from the data mining, and I'm sorry that I can't show you any of that today or how we did it. The third, however, critical element in the ChartEx architecture was the development of a workbench, which Helen was responsible for, which would allow the user always to interact with these results that the computer was suggesting to it and modify them in order to improve the system. I think at that point I'll just stop and hand over to Helen, if that's okay. I hope it's been fairly clear.
What I might do is I might just talk from my slides, but there's one slide
Well, I'm hoping
that might.
that yours will load easier, Helen. No.
Very-
Do you have everyone's slides there, or
Yep.
just your own?
I only have my own.
There we go. Let me just, Helen,
I'm down the
you're
bottom.
down at the bottom.
Oh, so the other PowerPoints might work better, we think.
Yeah, because yours was it was quite large. Let's see how quick it was.
In which case,
Come on over. Or do you want to do it between the two
I
anyways?
can do it between the two because I've got the workbench on this machine. I'll do it this way. Yeah.
There we go. Let me just give you a glass of water.
Just take
Are we in? Not quite. There we go. Right, let's hope. Yeah.
Okay. Different picture from York. So. No? Okay. So, we were in charge of creating a virtual workbench for historians to work with these charters in the way Sarah's been describing, to be able to do reasoning, annotating, sharing information, do everything that they could do on paper before, and possibly things that were difficult to do on paper, so innovative things. And the way we do this is called user-centered design. And that's probably not a very interesting picture of it anyway. But the idea is to, first of all, on the left, start from people's requirements. What is it people want to do? How do they do things now? What would they like to do that they can't do now? And then design something. And to not then just rush forward, as many software developers might do, and implement that, but to actually see, does that work for people? And there's something that's called claims analysis, whereby, particularly if people have been doing a complex task without computers, to be honest, it was quite an unusual situation for us to look at something where people hadn't really been using computers very much for the actual task. But you want to look at, are we capturing all the things they have done before and not losing anything that they've been able to do that they want to carry forward, as well as offering them new things? So the classic example of this is if you create a computerized system to move documents around. When they first did this, they found that when people moved documents around in an office, they often tended to put Post-it notes on the documents to tell each other, you know, this one's really important or this one's difficult. And the first computerized systems didn't allow you to do this, so people were finding it difficult to communicate about the documents. So in a claims analysis, you would look at the things that people really want to do that may not be a formal part of the system, and make sure they're carried forward. So you might do several iterations of looking at requirements and then showing people's designs, and they say, oh, well, we can't put Post-its on this, that's not going to be any good. And then when you feel either you run out of time or you think you might have a grasp on what you're doing, you go forward to designing a prototype, and then you evaluate that. And again, you might go around that cycle several times before you think you've really got something, and then you actually build the real thing. People in companies like Apple and Microsoft don't talk about doing this very much, but they actually do it. And it's been known for people to go around this cycle 30 times before they really produce the thing that you see. In fact, one of the most famous HCI people in the world admitted to doing it 30 times. So I'm glad it was him and not me. So we did some of this in the course of an 18-month project, and I'll try and describe that briefly for you. So the first thing we did is what's called contextual inquiry, which comes from anthropology, although a real anthropologist would probably cringe at calling this proper anthropology. But the idea is we've got historians, and we were very lucky to have enthusiastic cooperative historians, and we wanted to know what did they really do with these documents. We learned a lot about charters, but we were getting into the project and feeling, okay, we know it's something to do with charters, but what do you really do? So what we did was we got people to actually do a piece of research with charters with us, and Sarah will remember, I think, being videoed. It's rather painful and self-conscious, but it's really, really useful. So we got her to sit and we videoed her while she talked us through what does she really do when she gets hold of the charters. And that's quite hard. I think it's actually the more expert you are at what you do, the harder it is to talk about the process of what you're doing rather than the content of what you're doing. So that was an interesting challenge for us. I think I've got the same photograph. So we called it walking and talking because we started with Sarah, who's interested in the streets of York. So we sat with people and got them to do work, videoed them and asked questions if we weren't sure what's happening. And we had 8 professional medieval historians do that. I should probably keep this anonymous, but I don't think it's possible because historian 1 identified a set of shops on a street in York. That's obviously Sarah. We had another person who was interested in witness lists, another one who an abbot in Catalonia. This slide is really for when I talk to non-historians to know the flavor of what kinds of things people were doing, but that's probably obvious to you. So from these 8 sessions with 16 to 20 hours of video, we analyzed all this and we tried to then derive what were the requirements, what did people need to be able to do and what did they want to do. And it came down into 3 areas, which was particularly important. Searching for the documents, really well established area. There's lots of research on search, but interacting with individual documents to understand their contents and then relating information between documents, sets of documents. So we had requirements in each of those areas. And another area that came out as very important was the level of confidence in the decisions that the natural language processing and the data mining were doing. I think at the beginning, there was a lot of skepticism on the part of the historians that this was this going to work, and was it going to be correct, and how could they check and change things if they weren't correct. So we put a lot of effort into that, and there's a funny story associated with that. So, the slides have now stopped on me. Right. So we designed a paper prototype. So we didn't code anything. We actually, I think, did it in PowerPoint, but there was nothing behind it. And then we did what's called code design workshops. So we had as many of our historians, and I think these were very interesting sessions because we had people in Canada, people in the US, people in York, and I was on leave in Sweden at the time, and we all got together on Skype and discussed things. So we would go through the design ideas that we had, talking through them, and all the technical team were there as well to see what people thought, and then we changed and adapted things. And if you want to see how much we change things, in this PowerPoint, I've actually got the original version, and on my laptop I've got a working demo of the version we got to, and I realized how different they are now. So we really did change things and evolve things as we learned more about what people wanted. So the first design workshop concentrated on that first aspect, the search aspect, and then we had another co-design workshop where we talked and worked through ideas about exploring, about finding things in individual documents and then relationships. And okay, I'm going to go now.
Here we go.
Yeah, because it just says prototype. I'm actually going to go to the live demo. I'm sorry if you're watching online because you're not going to see this. So one of the funny things that happened was that as people who work in the computer science department, I think we had terrible misconceptions about historians. And we thought you'd all have old, slow laptops, which of course is not true. Because we did an evaluation of the system with medieval history PhD students and postdocs at Columbia University, which was one of our partners. And we'd spend a lot of time trying to design this so it would work on an old, slow, small screen. And I went to Columbia and found that each postdoc had 2 giant Mac screens and much better equipment than I had. So the idea is that the screen is divided into 3 columns. The left-hand column for doing the searching, the middle column for working with individual documents, and then the right-hand column for the relationships, to make it a kind of logical, not exactly a division, but a logical progression. So in here we've got, Roger, can you remember what this data set consisted of? We've got some of the charters. I think
it's
about
the same set. It's the Vickers Cornwall.
Yeah.
Some of Josie.
Yes. Don't give the plot away.
It's all right. We only did content.
So, if, for example, going on Sarah's charter, I was interested in goldsmiths in York and wanted to find out more. So first of all, I can pick which collections I'm going to search on, and everything is marked up into different entities. So I could ask for a search for the occupation goldsmith. And this is live. I've never done it before, you understand. In the Vickers Choral, and we've got 3 sets of Vickers Choral documents. So I do that search, and lo and behold, it comes back with a number of documents. And one of the things the historians said was that when they got the search back, they didn't just want to see that the document contained the word goldsmith. They wanted to see the context. So we say which document it's in, the actual number, because the historians, in computer science, we work in 3-letter acronyms. The historians seem to work in the numbers of the charters. So we've got the charter number, and then the bit of text surrounding the search term that's being found. So I have a look at those, and if I'm Sarah, I might say, ooh, this one looks interesting because it's telling me the younger son of Thomas the goldsmith. I like the look of that. Let me have a look at that. So I just click on the number, and now I get the whole text of the charter, and it's color-coded with the entities that have been extracted from the natural language processing and data mining in the colors that are used over here. And because I work with people with disabilities, these colors are colorblind safe. So all those thousands of colorblind medieval historians will not have a problem using our system because the colors. So that, and I say, okay, now this is a grant from, I can never save these names, I have to say, from Thomas to Simon de Havisham. He sounds interesting. I'd like to find out, does this Simon de Havisham, is that how you say it? Does he occur in any other of the charters? Maybe he's important for some reason, so I can just click on Simon, and then I get a listing of the other charters where Simon de Havisham occurs. And again, they're all clickable links. So if I want to go and look at those charters, I just click there and I can go and explore them. The other thing that we started to do, and we didn't get very far, was creating visualizations. And I always find this difficult on my laptop, of the people and the other entities in each charter. You'll need to come and have a look at this afterwards. We were particularly inspired because one of the historians, as I mentioned, well, in fact, two of them were interested in the witnesses to charters for particular reasons. And these visualizations show you who's granting the land or whatever it is, who are they granting it to and who's witnessing it. So that would be a useful and easy way of following through the people associated with particular charters. And again, you can then click on any of these people to find, has this person been a witness on other charters? So two funny little stories. We ended up with showing how you could refute a piece of information if you wanted to, because that seemed to be very important at the beginning. If the system proposed the relationship, so for example, if the system thinks that another charter has got Simon de Havisham, but in fact you don't think it's the same person, you can undo that if you want to. When we showed this to the expert medieval historians, they seemed to lose interest in that, and they trusted the natural language processing and the data mining. When we showed it to the PhD students and postdocs and talked to them about how you could annotate or refute things, they were completely obsessed with who would have the right to refute something. Could a PhD student do this, or could a professor? And we kept on saying, well, we're just designing the system. The politics of who uses it is not up to us. The other thing which we found interesting was when we showed the postdocs and PhD students the graphs of the witnesses and the people and said, do you think this would be useful? At the beginning, they all said, well, we've never seen anything like that. And we've never used anything like that. Within about 5 minutes, they were all coming up with ideas of how the graphical representations could be useful. So you do have to be a bit careful that you really want to give people what they want and what they need, but you can also show them things that they may not have realized would be useful, that open new possibilities for them as well. So I will finish there. If you want to do more searches, you're very welcome with, and I don't think you'll break the system. Thank you
very much, Helen.
Right.
Now we're going to move on to the second project we're looking at this evening, which is the from ChartEx through to the traces in time. And Sonia, are you going to start, are you?
I am.
Yeah.
Do I have slides?
I'm hoping you do. I don't remember yours being very big, so I think it should be fine. Where are you?
Further down the list of speakers you go, the more we're sweating and wondering whether our slides are going to work.
Yours was a tiny slides, if I remember, Roger.
Beautiful.
There we go. Shall we risk it?
What's the worst that can happen?
Oh, Sarah.
There we go.
Okay.
Over to
Thank
you,
you.
Sonia.
How are you moving them on? This one?
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Right. So a brief overview to start with of the Traces Through Time project. As Richard has said, this was an AHRC funded Big Data for the Arts and Humanities project. It ran from January 2014 to March of this year. So really, we're still really finishing off. That 15 months felt very quick. It went very fast indeed. It was a collaborative project. Similarly to ChartEx, we needed to bring together various skills to be able to do the work. So we had partners here at IHR who were the specialists in digital history. They brought the knowledge of the sources and the historical interpretation. Partners at Leiden, who also worked on ChartEx, who are the data mining specialists, and Roger and his team at Brighton, NLP experts. Overall aim of the project was to link up the records of people across the various data sets that TNA held. So lots of people appear in the records multiple times, sometimes in very different collections in different contexts, but also multiple times in the same collection. And lots of people only appear once. So there was an element of finding a needle in a haystack in trying to draw together these threads where people did appear multiple times. Some of the challenges, we wanted to know whether we could do this linking on different types of records from different historical periods. So for TNA, it's not sustainable for us anymore to develop very specialist interfaces or tools for working with particular data sets. So we're really interested in the extent to which anything we developed could work right across the different collections that we held. The data is quite fuzzy. So as you all know, I'm sure historical data can be quite messy. There can be errors in the way it was originally recorded. Errors creep in as it's digitized and transcribed. And we wanted tools that would handle that fuzziness in the data. And Helen talked briefly about confidence, and we wanted a measure of confidence. So we understood that sometimes we'd be able to make a link which looked really good, which a human observer would look at and say, yep, that's reasonably confident. And sometimes links would be more tenuous. So we really wanted to be able to put a figure to this with the aim that ultimately we'd make it all available, and the researcher using the system would be able to make a judgment about which links were of interest for their particular purpose. So we picked 3 sets of data to work with. We had some medieval data, which was from the National Archives, early modern data, which was state papers from British History Online, and modern data, which was First World War service records. And it's quite different. So the medieval data, as you've seen from ChartEx, is quite narrative and quite textual. It's not completely unstructured, but it's not a data set in the way that we received it. And it's quite rich in terms of places and relationships, and there's a narrative to it. The modern data, the example there is from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database, and that's at the other extreme. We'd look at that and call that a data set. It's been transcribed, often partially transcribed, so the original record may have been far richer. It's highly structured, and it's big. So for the modern data as a whole, I think we had 3 million records potentially available to us. We didn't use them all, but it was there. Early modern fell somewhere in between the two. At the outset, we thought this structure would be the biggest challenge in working across the data sets. But actually, a lot of that was dealt with in the pre-processing step, which was the natural language processing and text extraction for us. So for the algorithm itself, the biggest difference that we had to deal with was surnames. So in the early data, very few people have a surname. People are identified by relationships and places. And in the modern data, we expect everyone to have a surname. We expect it to be reasonably fixed, certainly for men. And that dealing with that was one of the biggest challenges in finding a system that would work reasonably well across different types of data. So the linker. very similar to ChartEx, so I'll just talk about a couple of the differences. So for us, data cleansing and standardization was about getting all the data into a standardized data model ready to work with. And so the NLP, which is an inherent part of the ChartEx system, I think, for us was a pre-processing step. And what we were taking was data which had a very standardized structure. The optimization step was necessary because the data is so big. So with small data, it's entirely possible to compare every person in the dataset with every other person in the dataset and work out whether they're similar. Once you get into tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of records, that just becomes too demanding to do. It wouldn't run in a realistic length of time. So we did a lot of work on how to optimize this to cut down the number of comparisons that would be required. And they were things like doing a pre-filter to throw out anything that was obviously different. So we didn't want to compare men with women, for example, or looking at comparisons that potentially would do many times over and doing them once and holding that result. So there was a lot of work there just to make this run in a reasonable time period for the amount of data we were handling. The statistics feeds into our scoring method. So we wanted to put this confidence figure to the links that we found. And the statistics are about saying, well, just how common is a name? And depending on that, how likely is it that two different people have the same name or the same set of attributes? And the big difference here from the earlier work was that once we'd done the linking, we fed that back round into the statistics to improve them for the next run. So it's quite iterative, and we're still building on that and creating better stats to help with our confidence scoring. So the basic model, attribute by attribute. So we compare surnames, forenames, dates of birth, every instance where two records have the same attribute. We can compare them, we can work out the probability of two different people sharing the same data and the probability of, determine a score given that it's the same person. And then we can use these statistics and frequency tables to work out a score, add them up, and that gives you a number. And it assumes that the attributes are independent, that there's no relationship between, for example, a forename and a date of birth, and so on. So just looking at some results, these are two results of very high scoring matches. So we have two individuals, one from AHRC and one from ADM 188. Quite long names, all four names in that first example matched, an exact match on date of birth. The names are relatively unusual, and that gives us a score of 25, which is a very high confidence score for us. The second example, the same. Parker is a slightly more common name, which explains the slightly lower score, but we call these high scoring matches. Lower confidence matches, I don't know if you can see those. They have missing attributes. So in AHRC, not everyone in this list has a date of birth. We have initials rather than full names. We have slightly more common names, and these are scoring 6-ish. And so we can establish a threshold which says a score of 6 or below. We'll consider that not really a match, or not a match that we can be confident of. And then in the middle, we had this grey area where really this is where we needed to dig in to try and enhance the algorithm and work out what was going on. So we see here examples with full names that we might expect to be scored more highly, and they're scoring quite low. And we see examples where you would look at that and think, well, we can't have a lot of confidence in that, but they're too high. So we had a little dig into this, and I'll give you. So one of the biggest assumptions we started with was that these attributes are independent. And some of what we saw in those medium confidence matches led us to challenge this. And also, we have in reality spelling variations or name variants and transcription errors, which were all pushing the scores down. But a human being looking at that would say, actually, that could be two ways of representing the same name or the same data. So we wanted to do something to address this. So independence of attributes. That's my place. This was a core assumption that we started with. And what we find is that for most attributes, it's reasonable to assume that they are independent. But there are some particular clusters where they're not, and where we needed to refine the algorithm to deal with this. So this is quite a stark example. this is the frequency of occurrence of a particular forename plotted by the birthday. And the forename is Valentine, and that spike is the 14th of February. And there are other names that have a particular association with a time of year where you see a similar pattern. So for these, the algorithm fails completely. It would assume that Valentine is quite an unusual name, really, and so two people called Valentine, it would boost them up in the confidence scores. But actually, if the birthday was the 14th of February, it's quite a common name and it doesn't apply. This is another example. This is Patrick Cashman in AHRC, who's been matched with reasonable confidence with 5 separate Patrick Cashmans from ADM 188, and they can't all be the same person. So we wanted to dig into this relationship between forenames and surnames and look at whether the assumption that they're independent really holds. And what we find is that they're quite closely correlated, and they're also correlated with place. So in this case, Cork. And so although Patrick's a relatively unusual name in our data as a whole, which is the whole of England and Wales and some Irish data here, Cashman is a relatively unusual name. Actually, Patrick Cashman is far more common than it should be. And so we need to weight it correspondingly lower to get a reasonable score. And that's why all 5 of those matches were given too high a score and all seem to be plausible. We don't have to guess about these combinations. One of the benefits of having big data to work with is that we can look for them in the data. So we ran some clustering over forenames and surnames. And what we get are sets of names that are more closely associated than they should be, where there is a clear association between them. And we identified these kind of clusters of names. So we've got some examples. There's a cluster, the blue cluster at the top right is names like Douglas, McKinnon, Munro, MacDonald. So I guess Scottish names. Although we didn't look at place, it is just the association between forename and surname that's thrown these up. The cluster, the green cluster there on the right, contains names like Lloyd, Howell, Owen. So the majority of names fall outside of this, but there are these clusters where actually we need to do something different to compensate for the fact that they're otherwise going to be scored as being quite unusual. So what we did for that was to adjust the population figures to say actually all of these clusters are quite closely associated with a place. And rather than taking the population of England and Wales when we work out our confidence, we should take a smaller figure, which is the population of that smaller place. So for Patrick Cashman, I think we didn't take Cork, but we took Ireland, and that pushes the scoring down. So we wanted to look also at some of the fuzziness in the data. So this is an example of a record from MH47, which is the slightly pink one, and WO372, which is the white one next to it. And these records weren't originally matched by our scoring method. And you'll see that a T has been mistranscribed as a J in the WO372 record. So initially that was no match. The third record at the bottom is an entry in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database. And this entry matched to both of the other records. So it matched to the MH47 record on similarity of name and to the WO372 record on surname and service number. And there's actually a slight discrepancy. In WO372, it's transcribed as 27645, and in the War Graves database, it's 28645. And we can see from the image that that's because there's a slight fold in the page at that place, which has produced that mistranscription. So we wouldn't have linked the original 2 records, but because we have this third one linked to both, we've been able to spot this transcription error and work out what's going on. By looking at sets of records that are linked in this way, that are dissimilar by our third record, we can start to build up sets of commonly occurring those back into the algorithm to improve the original matching. This is another example, Henry and Harry. We looked at pairs that were matched with very high confidence, but which had one attribute that was different. And that gave us these pairs of name variants that we could build back in. And we had to think long and hard about how to build it in, because actually not every Henry is also a Harry. So as well as creating a rule that says Henry and Harry are interchangeable, we needed a probability associated with them, and it's around 1%. So again, a benefit of having big data to work with is that these kinds of patterns can emerge from it, and we can learn from them and feed them back into the scoring. Oh, and this is an example, just to finish off. So in the example here, we had, just to make sure I've got notes, an appeal against conscription from Robert Fulwell Sawyer. He appealed on the grounds that his family business would fail if he was conscripted. And we have a record for Robert Sawyer in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database, which shows that he was killed in action. And the system linked these two records. So as a piece of research to try and validate this link, we had a look at the records of the Autotype company. So the family business, which he said would fail if he was conscripted, was Autotype, and that company is still in existence today. And on the website, it tells us that the owner's son, Charles Sawyer's son, was killed on active service in 1917, which helps us with our confidence that actually we've made a valid link between the appeal and the war graves database. The Autotype company has lots of records in the archives and in Discovery, and a particular record, which actually is in the Manchester Archives collection, mentions Frank Newens. Autotype at the time was a printing and photography company, and the Frank Newens mentioned in the record is a photographer. There's another Frank Robert Newens in the Royal Navy records, and these two records are also linked by the algorithm. And again, as a way of manually following this up and trying to validate it, we had a look at Frank Robert Newens' records, and it shows that he worked for the Newens Bakery, which is in Kew, just around the corner from the National Archives, in fact. That bakery is still in existence today. They have a website, and on the website is a photograph of the owner, Arthur Newens, with his son Frank, who distinguished himself, which again helps us validate that we can't manually validate every link in the database, because a selection of them and at different confidence scores, just to see what was going on. The Kew Bakery is still there, and this is a very tenuous connection to Henry VIII, because we wanted to link ourselves with royalty in some way. The Kew Bakery makes Maids of Honour, which were Henry VIII's favourite cake. They're still made to the same recipe, and the Traces Through Time project team has been down to the bakery and experienced them. So future work, the project's ended, the AHRC project's ended, but for us it's still something we want to pursue, and we want to take those outputs and we actually want to use them at TNA. So let's talk about that.
I'm going to slide over and you can sit down. Let's get us out and in. There we go. Over to you, Emma.
Oh, just. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we're going to use these actual research outputs and kind of put them into our live services and use them to further kind of take them a bit further as part of the work of the National Archives. So we are obviously a research institution, but we are also a commercial organisation. We are a government department, and we're a cultural institution as well. So we have a number of different functions, and the research we do, and we try and make it feed into improving kind of access to our collection as well. That's a really important part of that. So we plan to use the research outputs from Traces Through Time to make them part of live operational service, which is Discovery, which is our catalogue. We also plan to use them on further data sets so that we can improve our data and improve access. We're going to use them to open more records, which I'll talk about in a minute, and also feed into some linked data work that we're doing and encourage reuse through online presence. So I'll just talk through these. This is a screenshot of Discovery, and this is our online catalogue. This holds 32 million descriptions of records held by TNA and 2,500 archives across the country. And this is where we are going to use the Traces Through Time's outputs and actually embed them in the system. I'm going to try and do a demo of some prototypes that we have online, see if the laptop likes it. It may not. I've got some screenshots if not, because this has happened to me before. So in terms of adding into discovery, Sonia obviously went through some good examples there. I'm going to try and see if this likes it, if not. Death by PowerPoint for all of us. Oh, wow. Hey. There you go. So this is one of the prototypes that one of our web designers has put together for me. This is a fake details page from Discovery, and this is a record of a Lawrence Victor Lincoln. And you'll see down here, we've added this bit here, which is basically the output of traces through time. So we have linked two people, two records as being the same people. And through this, what we will do is in time add this into Discovery, and then you'll be able to do a search for something. So say you know your ancestor is called Lawrence Victor Lincoln, you can search for that, but it will also tell you that this one, which is LV Lincoln, which obviously wouldn't come up in that search, is the same person. So this has been matched with a 98% similarity. There's a difference in the years of birth and in the use of initials, but because it's an uncommon surname, it has matching initials and it has the same day and month of birth, but a different year, it has matched them, and we're comfortable with that level of matching. And you can, if it will let me, see what it does. I might only do one of these because it's a bit nerve-wracking. You can click and see the other one, but that's probably a bridge too far. Where's the presentation going? Oh, it's down there.
Sorry.
That's all right. Okay. Cool. So that's a kind of example of what we're doing in terms of putting it live. Also in the future, we could do things like add familial relationships. So if you're researching your family tree, for example, you might want to know that we actually know there's the record of someone's son or someone's father or their uncle as well. So, and we can hopefully derive that from the algorithm as well. So there's lots of kind of further ways in which we can take this. The other kind of thing we need to consider is if we start mining other data sets which have more well-known people in them, you tend to have a lot more records. So say we decided to mine some data that had lots of records about Winston Churchill, for example, you're not just going to have 2 links then, you're going to have thousands of links because we obviously hold thousands of records of these kind of more well-known people. So how do we show those? And these are the kind of things we're thinking about for the future. Another way that we're using the algorithm is to enable us to open records. Now, at the National Archives, records pertaining to individuals are closed for 100 years for data protection, but they can be opened earlier if we have proof of death. Quite depressing, but true. We have been able to use the algorithm and use our work on this to open around 20,000 records by comparing death data against this data set, which is the HomeGuard records data set, and identify where we know for sure that people have died, and then we can actually open them so people can download them and access them. So this is obviously an important thing for increasing access. We can only open them if we are completely certain that they're exact matches. So we're kind of slightly more conservative around which ones we open here. We wouldn't do a 98%, it has to be 100% match, obviously for legal reasons. And we need to look at the National Archives what our risk appetite is around how many we open. But this is kind of a good actual real life way of using this work. Traces Through Time also created an underlying data schema. And this is a kind of pictorial example of it. And we use that on the project, and we're going to use it beyond in general data activities. So one of the ways in which we're going to use it is to some linked data work that we're doing. So we're using a different coding language for the linked data work, but we're using the thinking behind the schema to do that. So we are looking at linking some data from SC8. SC8 is a series of ancient petitions, which is basically people petitioning the King, Council, Parliament, various officers of state to redress grievances and grant favours. In case you don't know, you may all know that. Apologies if I'm reaching to the converted. I didn't know that until today. So we've been looking at building up. You can see here the daughter of, son of, bastard son of, widow, those kind of things. We've been looking at some kind of name authorities and some linked data things online to try and find these things called friend of a friend, you probably know. So, but a lot of them don't actually exist. So the one bastard son of is not one that's actually in the kind of general dictionary. So we're having to create our own one.
Oh.
No, it's not in the standard, but it's quite a common one that comes up in our records. So we're looking at how we're going to make that work, so we don't lose that knowledge and that data. And there you go. There's a slide explaining how we're going to do that, which I'll skip through because I know we're a bit short on time. Places is another thing that we're looking at. So in the SC8 data, there's about 33,000 geographic locations. We need to consider here both the archaic and the modern when thinking about this. And we have been working with the English Place Name Society to share their data with them and make that easier, using the traces through time algorithm again to tag up this data and think about it, and publishing it as linked data the society will hopefully in the future be able to data and data set themselves without us having to send them manual updates, which is what we have to do at the moment. So it's all about just making access easier and improving how it works. And lastly, one of the other things we're able to do is use our extensive communications abilities to promote this work a bit further. Website code published on GitHub, and we're doing stuff like publishing blogs and things like that to kind of promote this work a bit more, encourage reuse, and hopefully we'll get some examples in time of people actually using this algorithm and using the tools that we've developed themselves, and then we can hopefully keep improving them. So that's kind of the stuff we're doing to make it all real.
Thank you very much. And now we'll pass over to Roger to kind of tie the two together in some way.
Yes, yeah, in some way, hopefully.
You take your seat.
Sorry.
There we go. There we are. There we go.
Brilliant, thank you. Put my glasses on, I think. Cool. I'm cool. Everyone's drinking.
Save me up.
Let's go. Okay, first of all, this is the title slide that follows the title that was published. Actually going to talk very NLP and data mining itself. My rationale for that was that you would have picked up bits of it from the previous talks. And to the extent that you didn't, we can talk about it afterwards, because there are some slides certainly embedded, I think, in your slide pack, which we can show a bit more. Also because actually going into the details would be quite a long talk in itself, and might not be as interesting to you as you would have thought. But also because this is a fairly unique opportunity to reflect on the two projects together. So I thought I'll do a bit of that. Coming from a very technical perspective. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to spend of my 10 minutes, I'm going to spend 5 of them talking about the two projects from a technical perspective, and then kind of switch over to the whole issue of the conversation between digital humanities people and computer scientists, and hopefully provoke some questions at the end, maybe. Okay, so first of all, the situation I find myself in is the one-man, two governors position, where one governor is here and one governor is here, not at the same time, so the two projects didn't quite overlap, but essentially we were doing what we, in scare quotes, we call it deep processing. You can think of it as kind of AI. So it was the natural language processing, the data mining, deeper bits in both of these projects. Now, actually, this is it was really 2 men. It wasn't really 2 men, it was 2 teams in both of the projects, which was ourselves at Brighton doing natural language processing, and Arno Knob's group at Leiden doing the data mining stuff. So these were the two, if you like, together we sometimes call this text mining, but we did them fairly separately. So we had some natural language processing and data mining sitting there in both projects. So this is the situation that we were in. Now, within the two projects, what I'm going to do is just show you architecture diagrams for both projects, just to show how our bits fitted in. Now, really, in this diagram, this is a diagram of the development architecture for ChartEx. Actually recaps some of the stuff we've heard before. So at the beginning of ChartEx, there was this, we worked with just a very small number of charters, and we talked to historians, and the process that Sarah and Helen both described, both to develop a markup scheme and requirements for Workbench. And then we persuaded our historians to do a whole load of manual markup of charters. And we did the development of the two technical systems and also of the Workbench down there. At the bottom of this is the bit that you would consider the runtime architecture. So this is the system that we were building. And it's a fairly straightforward, you start off with thousands of charters, you pump them through some natural language processing, you then pump that through some data mining, and then you store that in a kind of intelligent network database, and which Helen described, uses the database, the repository, to provide services to historians or to researchers. So that was the kind of ChartEx architecture. The traces through time architecture is a little bit more intricate, in fact becomes more intricate when you see, Sonia had a slide which had a little bit more detail on how some of these things go. But essentially, we've got documents here. We've got a content extraction as a kind of pre-processing, and there's two types. There's shallow language processing and deep language processing. These are not supposed to be, I mean, it's not, there's nothing particular to be read into those terms. Shallow language processing, we tend to mean the kind of fairly superficial pattern matching statistical analysis kind of thing. The deep language processing, it's the harder stuff. It's the stuff that we do. So it's trying to understand the language at a semantic level. And then we have these kind of optimization processes because we've got so much data. And then record linkage, which is what the data mining is called inside Traces Through Time, and visualization tools of various sorts, which is what the websites are beginning to. So that was the kind of architecture for Traces Through Time. So if we just quickly kind of compare those two things a little bit, and just to see what the differences are, again, coming from the perspective of the people doing some of the technology inside. The first thing we notice at the beginning is the range of the data. Although that box is bigger than this box, in reality, this box is much bigger than that box. So we've got thousands of charters, but we've got millions of documents down in Traces Through Time. The top one, it's a fairly restricted range over a period of time. The type of document, they're medieval charters, they're all free text as far as we're concerned, and they were in English and Latin, so we had a linguistic thing. In Traces Through Time, it's a much wider range of document in terms of time period, and that is reflected in the language, but also in the format of the data. So some of it's free text, a lot of it is in these record form, which has bits of free text in it. It's not completely nicely laid out with all the work done. There's a lot more variability, and it's much bigger. So that's a difference. And then there's the difference in what we're trying to do with this stuff. The complexity of what the deep processing is trying to do. In ChartEx, the focus was primarily around places. Really what we were looking for were places and then people attached to places. And we took a fairly broad relational view of what we do. We were trying to build these kind of quite high level structures, network structures between places, people, things that happened, buying and selling of properties, those kinds of things. In Traces Through Time, the focus is very much on the people. And as Emma showed, we had actually, inside that project, we have a very detailed model of what you can say about a person, including, you know, the easy things like their relatives and their children and their bastard sons and whatever, but also things like whether they've won awards and whether those awards have more than one name. So somebody who's got an MBE or you know, all sorts of awards, but also very intricate details about people so that we can link all these people together. So it's a different kind of model. In one sense, it's more focused, but in another sense, it's also more detailed. So they're quite different kinds of things. And at the end, I just put just to mention about the kind of target users. The target users in ChartEx are researchers. That's in scare quotes because it was not intended. The project wasn't only aimed at academic researchers, but it was essentially, if you like, we had a controlled view of, we were building this tool for people wanting to do a particular kind of research task. And that's what we built it around. In Traces Through Time, the delivery on is, you know, the National Archive website, which could have anybody on it doing whatever they wanted, kind of thing. So it was a less control over who the users were and what they might be able to do and what they might want to do. And so when you get these kind of differences, it tailors the way that you develop your system in terms of where you put the complexity. So in ChartEx, broadly speaking, we had a relatively narrow data set, and we could do quite complicated analysis on it, and we could build tools that targeted users that could really make use of that. In Traces Through Time, the scale of the data was bigger. The model was consequently simpler in order for us to be able to really do the work. And the way it's presented to the users is in some sense simpler, but because it's over so much more data, the things that you can do, the areas that you gain leverage, that you have power, are different. So you have this kind of large scale, these large scale effects that Sonia was talking about. So in a very, very simple summary, to some extent, what we were doing in ChartEx was building kind of bespoke. Bespoke isn't quite the right word, but focus tools aimed towards researchers and where we had a good idea of what they were doing. A lot of what's going on in Traces Through Time is kind of enterprise oriented. A lot of what Emma was talking about, that trying to deliver the same kind of technologies into an environment where you're constrained by enterprise considerations. You've got to deliver this on a large scale. You've got to integrate with other bits of a very large system, other data formats. And so you get a kind of a different feel. So it really, what I was trying to do here was just to give a sense of what the contrast between these two systems is. Though at their heart, they have a lot of processing, which is really trying to do the same things in different places and the different effects. So that was one bit of my reflection. The second bit really is about this conversation between computer science and digital history. So if we step back, and actually this has come up in a number of the comments that have been made around already in the talks. We start from the position, so when we're working this day, what can computer science do for the historians at an abstract level? And what we've seen is the state of the art in computational analysis of these things is it's broadly based on statistical approaches. Now, not all our work is statistical, but it's easier to characterize it as statistical because when you start working with real data, even when it isn't, it behaves a little bit like it is. Well, I can expand on that another time. And one of the qualities of statistical approaches is the answers are always only approximate. So you've seen all this talk about confidence scores and various other things. We're only giving approximate answers. And I've distinguished two of the standard different kinds of approximation that you get out of these systems. It's the same as you get out of something like search engines like Google. And one of them technically we call precision, which is having a focus on making sure that all the answers we give you are right, but that means we may miss some answers that are right. We might not give you all the answers, but all the answers we give you, we know are right. And the contrasting feature is called recall, which is a focus on getting as many of the right answers as you can, but allowing for the fact you might get some wrong answers too. So these are two standard measures of performance in these statistical systems. And it's standardly accepted that there is a trade-off between. You can't do both at once. And this is, I found this picture on the web. It's such a beautiful picture of apples and pears, but I had to use it. So this is just by a simple answer. So we've got a whole pile of apples and pears, and you say you want to know which ones are the apples, right? Now, you know, a perfect system, you would pick out exactly all the apples and none of the pears, right? Now, a realistic computer system might say, well, I'll say all the red things are apples, right? Because I can see all the red things. It's not bad, actually. I think it's probably the case that all the red pear here, it might count as red. But always, so if I gave you back all the red things, then in terms of precision, I wouldn't have done badly. Most of the things I gave you would be apples. Right. In terms of recall, no, I've missed a whole load of green apples. So the recall wouldn't be very good. So it gives you a sense of, you know, how when you're designing a system, you're trying to approximate your definition of an apple, and you get these trade-offs. Now there are some bizarre mathematical. If you ever ask mathematicians to produce definitions for you, be very wary of what you get. if I want a system which has perfect recall, I'm going to give you all the apples, right? It's very easy. I'll just give you everything, right? I'll give you the whole pile, and I know you've got all the apples. You've got all the pears as well, but I don't care, because you just asked for all the apples, and you've got all the apples. And in a contrast, there is a rather obscure one, which is a bit of a logical thing. I want to give you perfect precision, right? My definition of precision is all the answers I give you are apples, right? That's perfect precision, right? Right, I'm going to give you nothing, right? And all the answers I've given you are definitely apples, there just aren't any. So these are two cases. It's possible to get perfect precision by giving nothing. It's possible to get perfect recall by giving everything. But there's a, the tricky bit is finding the definition in the middle. Enough things that you've got enough apples, and you're not, and you haven't missed too many. Okay, so that's the way we think about these things from the computer science point of view. From the point of view of digital humanities, what do you want? Okay, do you want perfect results? Well, everybody would love perfect results. I was sitting in a talk at a workshop recently where somebody who works on similar systems like us actually put up slides saying, okay, what the historians want is perfect precision, and if they can't have it, they're not interested. And you take you back and say, but hang on, we know we can't do that. And then I thought to myself, is that a reasonable response from my side, right? So how do you respond if we say we can't do that, right? Now you might say, well, go away until you can. We're not interested in your tools, right? Because you don't have a good way of judging the things we're saying to you, right? So when we say we can't give you perfect results, we then start saying, well, okay, well, we'll give you control. We've told you that there's this recall precision trade-off thing. We'll give you some control over it. We'll give you a slider on your interface. So you can increase the precision, but you get fewer and fewer things, or you take it the other way and increase the recall, but you get more and more rubbish. And you can play with it. And you might think, oh yeah, well, it's better than nothing, I suppose. It's very hard to judge how useful it really is to you. How easy is it to understand what that control gives you, except by playing with it? And even then, if you're working with data and you don't know the right answers, you can't really tell whether it's giving you what it's doing for you. And how does it help you interpret the results that you get? So it's not obvious. I mean, it's the answer that we produced at the workshop at the end of TTT. We'll give you a control, and everybody says, yes, please. But thinking beyond that, there is work to be done to understand what you can do with that and how you would understand it. And so this is kind of my last slide. The other thing that we always say in response to this is, well, we always keep a human in the loop. This is the standard phrase for producing computer systems that don't work well enough to be let out in the wild on their own. We always keep a human in the loop. So the tools always require human interpretation, right, of the results, because the tools don't work well enough to do it themselves reliably. And so one big question, is this really just a cop-out by the computer scientists? Are we really just saying, sorry, our tools don't work well enough? It's to some extent, it's a kind of protection, because there are all these kind of ethical issues about letting computers loose to do things on their own and make decisions, right? Well, you don't. You always have a person there. So it's just a pragmatic expression of the state of the art. But there's another aspect to it, which is that, do we really mean that we need an expert in the loop? Right? Because one of the things that I'm beginning to become more aware of is that you produce a tool to support an expert, to support somebody doing a task. The economic forces in the workplace respond by de-skilling the person that uses the tool. So if you need it, if you need, it doesn't.
No.
Well, Helen can disagree with me, but in some workplaces, that's what happens. In the real commercial workplace, right? You produce better tools to support some operation, then employers start employing less skilled people, or people that are only skilled in using that. So, and that's a little bit dangerous if we've been assuming that we've got an expert, and suddenly the tools are being given to people who aren't expert, because the managers think that the tool is filling a gap. And something to think about. And Helen will obviously have something to say. She's not seen my slides. And so, I mean, this is my last point, really. It's about these conversations. And I think it's interesting reflecting on these things in terms of what other people have said here, which I was listening to, and some of it not having thought of it in this way before. That, I mean, in this digital humanities adventure, I mean, are we still really only just at negotiating about what's possible and what's required? How far down that road are we? My feeling is that there's a little bit from the computer science point of view that we've come along with these tools and say, we've got these tools, and you should like our tools even though they don't work terribly well. And in some sense, and although we will talk about, okay, we've got these tools, how will you use them? We're not quite asking the right questions about, what is it that you really need and are we really addressing it? So I've done, I think. Thank you.
Well, thank you, all of you. Now go on to questions. I'm sure from all of those fruitful talks, full of a lot of interesting things, I'm sure there's many questions to be had. I think we'll probably go about 20 minutes or so for questions, which will take us to 7 o'clock, and then we'll finish off there. So questions before. Jane, do you want to kick us off, please?
It's for Emma and Sonia, really. First of all, to say you've done a massive amount of work since March. It's really impressive. But a couple of questions about rolling it out to your Discovery service. Is there a rough timetable for when that might be available for public use? And secondly, how have you got from a position where the scores are sort of 25, 23 is a high confidence, 6 is okay, to a percentage?
Shall I take that?
Yeah, sure.
I'll take the second one first. So what you saw there was a mock-up, because obviously it's not really rolled out to Discovery yet. And one of the things we're really grappling with is how to express our scores. And we don't know the answer to that yet. So one idea is that maybe a percentage is a meaningful thing to the users, which a number, a score, perhaps isn't. But we don't know is the answer. we haven't quite got there yet.
One of the things we're going to do with those prototypes is actually do some user testing. So we're going to try them with various different languages and different kind of, whether you've got a visual indicator or a percentage, and see how they respond to those and kind of how that works for them. Because one of the key things you have to factor in is that a lot of the records that we're linking, if you want to access them online, you have to pay for them. So there's something around letting people understand that this is there to kind of guide them and help them with their research. But basically, we're not guaranteeing that it's the same person because it hasn't been checked. So we need to kind of check the language and make sure we get that kind of right balance, so that it actually meets our users' needs.
I know people not quite understanding what the numbers meant. The real thing with the workshops, isn't it? So it'd be interesting to get.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see the results. We'll probably do a blog about it or something. So. Do you want to answer the question about the timelines? I can't remember.
No, so for this year, so to the end of March, we've set ourselves the target of choosing a subset of material in Discovery, running it through the processing to generate the links, and having some prototype Discovery screens with that real data behind it. So we won't be linking the whole of Discovery imminently, but we would hope that by the end of March we'd have something that people can look at and start to work with and give us feedback on.
Another question. We'll hear and then we'll go to the back.
Well, I know these people quite well. I suppose I've got lots of questions later on, but I'd start by responding to this last question there. And I think your answer actually comes from Helen's presentation at the beginning. So few historians have actually thought about the decisions they make and broken down the processes of what they do, that while they might be in reality willing to accept 80, 70, I would probably often say a lot of them would be willing to accept 60% confidence in a lot of the assumptions they make. So I'm working on a project coming to the end of it now where it started off with someone writing, it turned out 8,000 biographies in a Word file on his own, making absolutely heroic assumptions about who was who from different documents. And it's only by sitting him down, talking through the data-based process of doing this that he started to question and to understand the probabilities and things around that. So 90% accuracy. I think most early modern economic historians who understand things in data terms accept 80% as a good, certainly good enough figure for this kind of thing. But yeah, I think the kind of workshopping that you were talking about at the beginning is.
I mean, I think just the slight small source of that is that I think one of the issues, one of the concerns in my mind is not so much whether people accept it or not, but whether I'm really confident they understand what it means. I mean, I'm not sure I understand what it means. Like, you know, if I give you a system where I've scored it as getting 80% of something right, now I can, if you then use it for something which is also broadly statistical, then we can feed that number in and get another number out at the end. But that's not what you're doing, right? I mean, too often been in environments where we say, well, it only works, you know, 60, 70% of the time, and you give it to typically a company actually, and they use it as though it works right all the time. They don't care. And the danger is that they forget that it's not right all the time. And, you know, so treating 80%, accepting 80% is good. Treating 80% as though it's 100% is bad. And that's that kind of difference.
Which is why you need the expert.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think so. I mean, I think one point that I should make clear is when I'm thinking about these things, I'm thinking these things, this isn't, to me, an interface issue. It's something that feeds the interface design. Yeah. It's a technology issue, right? This is all we can do. It's a separate question about how it's presented. So this isn't just about, oh, the interfaces are wrong because they're doing this. It's actually, you know, how do we work with what we can do? And how might we need to change what we do to respond to different pressures? Because we've just come over it. This is how we do it. Yeah. These are the numbers. This is how we measure it. You know.
But to get historians to understand how you're doing, you need to get historians to understand what they're doing in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
And if I can just maybe comment on what you were saying, Roger. So I don't think we disagree as much as I thought. But to say we're also not interested just in the interface. I think that's a misunderstanding. Not by you, but in general about human-computer interaction. We're interested in what people are trying to do. And while I would agree, many people are trying to roll out systems that in effect de-skill people, what the prevailing philosophy in human-computer interaction, I would say, is that you're trying to create systems where you just do the things that computers are good at and people find boring, and people do the things that people are good at and find interesting and useful. But as you say, if you're not quite, if you need to then reflect on what it is, what I'm doing, not just telling me lots of fascinating things about it's in yours, but what process did you go through so we can support that best? So that's the kind of system we're trying to create, and I don't think that's in disagreement.
Yeah, no.
Sarah, would you have a reflection on that as the historian involved in this?
Yes, and one of the things I missed out because of the PowerPoint
Apologies.
was, you know, our reflections as from the historians in the group about what was useful about being in the project. And obviously, one of the things that was useful about being in the project was developing some tools that had some results. But actually, I think as useful a product was the way in which we were made to reflect on our processes, both in the way that Helen has described, but also at the kind of deeper language processing level when we're reading a document, how are we extracting information from it? And we spent hours and hours by Skype on these conversations. We used but basically they were conversations between all of us as historians and all the technical people about how we were extracting information from texts anyway, which was deeply revealing. And you know, to the point that you know, at York and Columbia, we thought that we should actually be embedding this in graduate training, as well as paleography and languages. This kind of really structured and discursive, close reading text should be part of the training program. So I think that's for us, it's beyond the kind of the aims of the project.
But I'd say in that regard, it's probably not just embed for postgraduates. That would be a very interesting academic article on methodology and reflections on methodology for historians themselves.
Yes.
So I'd certainly encourage you to think about, you know, producing something like that. I'll pass over here and then we'll go to you, Adam.
Okay, so just I suppose to sort of follow on from that. I mean, I think that you might be selling people a bit short there. I've watched, family historians are very good at juggling those sorts of relevance criteria all the time. They have shifting, they know that they can trust some pieces of information more in one context and some more in another context, and they're able to make very intelligent and precise judgments, and in fact use the tool that you sort of implied, the idea of slide. Well, actually Ancestry does work like that. You can control the relevance, the level of relevance, and they're very adept at doing that. So I think we've got some evidence that actually people should be able to kind of get on with that sort of thing. But my question in terms of discovery is, where does the threshold have to be in terms of the accuracy level before people start getting cross? Thinking about when you're talking about testing, that's quite hard to test. If it's 85%, and if let's say it really is 85%, so 1 in 6, is that before you start getting, like pitchforks and torches? How can you find that out in advance?
Well, it's an interesting question. We do have some experience from my past where we reference a number of, we do reference the Doomsday book, I think, and put it online. And it was probably, I would say, about 95% correct. There were some issues with the data. And we did have a kind of pitchfork type situation where people were like, you're the National Archives, everything you publish should be correct. And we were like, well, this is, a trial, we're just seeing how this works and what the feedback is. And obviously the feedback wasn't exactly what we were hoping for, but it did teach us a little bit about how we kind of explain what we're doing and the language you use and how you kind of communicate stuff. Because quite often with these things, it's not actually anything to do with the technology, it's to do with people understanding what are you offering them and what can that give you. And as long as you understand that offering, you can choose if you want to use it or not. So that's part of the work that we'll be doing around the user experience testing, around the language, trying different percentage levels, see what people feel about it. Ask them, would you actually buy a record based on this? Would you, what other factors would you use? And that's all kind of part of the project, which should be some interesting learning. But I think it'll be fairly high based on my experience. But that's just,
would you take relevant feedback, or would you then have the ChartEx problem that people go, thank you very much, but that wasn't relevant? Would you suggest that?
Well, what in the second year of Choices Through Time in the investment bid we have at TNA, one of the things we want to look at is something where people can say, yes, this is the right person, or no, it isn't. And then we can set and hopefully then improve the data as we go. But obviously we're at the kind of in the beginning stages, but it is our kind of aspiration to do that as well.
Anna?
I kind of want to follow up on that actually. And I think that these types of projects where you're working with sets of records and then you're applying a process to them using computers, there's an assumption that you're doing this work, that this work then when you're finished with it is now done. And that we view things in history. If James writes a book, for example, I will tell all my students, oh, this was a brilliant book, or oh, it's crap for these reasons. And then the next person comes along and they build upon that by looking at it a completely different way. But what you guys have done is, I mean, from the person on the street, as far as they're concerned, is it's finished. And that's, I think, maybe why you're getting these complaints about levels of accuracy, perhaps. But I'm just curious what your perspective is on how this is different than historiography, which is these arguments that appear in books, and of course they're all wrong. And then you've got the data analysis that people expect it must be right because the computer did it.
You can answer that one.
So I think you're right. I take your point, but I suppose from our perspective, what we're trying to do is to help people access the data. And we're very alert to the fact that we have a range of different users who will want to ask different questions and work with it in different ways. And this is one tool which can do certain things and not do everything. In terms of whether it's fixed, again, we could regenerate those links, which improve the algorithm. But what you see there is a snapshot. The links that we want to expose to the user at that point in time. So I think you're right, but equally I think it is what it is.
Could you sell it as historiography? I mean, should this
to
be
explain to
shoved?
you what historiography is.
So it's the argument where a historian says all poor people are victims of their circumstances, and then someone else comes along and says, no, that's wrong, poor people are lazy, and they just argue back and forth about it. And this is what historians do, effectively. They just argue with evidence. But you you've created an argument using natural language processing or statistics or whatever it is, but then you don't present it in that conversation.
No,
So
so
it
we
doesn't
wouldn't
trickle into
interpret
that.
it in that way. So even if we identified some set of links, which you could argue with whether they were the right links or the right way to do it, we wouldn't be then putting a particular interpretation on that. So in that sense, we're not doing history. I think what we're trying to do is provide access to data.
Sorry, if I can, it is more like producing an edition of a text than it is producing a work of scholarship in terms of traditional historiography.
Yeah.
There might be an edition of
Computer
Shakespeare
science.
that's in years, but it's a reinterpretation, but it's treated in that intermediate position.
Presumably within computer science, you might say your algorithm is rubbish and I've got a better one.
Well, we certainly have that. I mean,
Yeah,
we have ways of
what I'm saying.
scoring systems according, if we know what we're trying to get out, which is not always straightforward.
If I could butt in as an archivist, I would say that there's a general assumption, I think, probably on the part of archivists as well as historians, that there is historical interpretation, and then there's the archive catalogue, which is the voice of God, unchanging. And actually, behind the scenes, a lot of us are agonising a little bit about the way that catalogues themselves are historically relative. And in a sense, this is just part of a wider issue about whether archive catalogues are the voice of God or not. I'd love to think that mine are, but I'm sure they're not.
Yes, I mean, I think from our perspective, we tend to think of this as enriching data sets rather than interpreting them. So in some sense, it's creating a new data set that you can make arguments over. But yes, it's not, these things are not fixed things, as is typical with computer software. You come to it next week and the first thing it'll do is, can I update you to release number 2.7, of the data, which has been done with a slightly tweaked algorithm and will give you different things, and that's the way it will be.
And from the human-computer interaction point of view, it's an ongoing process all the time. So you're always thinking, well, we could improve the visualization. We could, and going back to your point about bespoke, we always tried to look at this as one example for medieval historians, but with the eye of we would then want to. Would it work with a different set of historians? Would it work with family historians? Would it work with different documents? How much would you have to change it? So it's the same kind of ongoing process that never ends, which is just as well because we're academics.
The Digging into Data team used a kind of useful metaphor right at the very beginning of the project, where they asked us whether we were trying to create a new historical interpretation by digging through data, or whether we were creating a new shovel to dig through the data in a different way. And all the projects were kind of, fell in one of those two camps. So there were some that were trying to come up with new historical interpretations of data. I think the one about trading networks in the 19th century was doing that. But we were very much trying to develop a new shovel. So, that wasn't really, we weren't trying to come up with a new historical interpretation of changes particularly.
In the first instance, I presume over time.
Yes, yeah, and as I said, the process before of making us really reflect deeply about how those texts worked has been quite suggestive of all sorts of things. But the in terms of what it was funded for, it was funded to develop a new process for accessing data, not for interpreting.
James.
First, just a comment on the voice of God. One of my real hopes is that a lot of these projects that use catalogue data at large scale will be drivers to help users understand that catalogues are built by people. We know that the BL catalogue is very much built by people, and using it as a canonical data source is going to get you in a lot of trouble. But my question, and it's probably given the time more a question we might explore at the pub, is about interfaces, and kind of a question I thought I had to ask, which is about. So you mentioned, Sarah, that one of the great values from the team's perspective was actually looking at the data and the way the process of working upon it, and actually thinking about your methodology in relationship to query upon the data. You guys get that out of it as a team. At the end, there becomes a public interface which is usable, but all of that learning work, in most cases, I've not used ChartEx, I don't know, but in a lot of these projects, all of that learning is then hidden away behind the interface for very good design reasons, very good functionality reasons. And I just wonder, I almost have this lingering wonder around that, funding projects that end up with interfaces which try and replicate some kind of process is great. And yet at the same time, I think we need to emphasize that somewhere in this kind of thing, the value of the middle bit. And I think I'm hoping with the next round of Deacon's data that they can come up into projects that kind of maybe don't get as far as the interface and try and emphasize the value of that middle bit of teams working with data in that form. And actually the product they're creating is more of a sort of, right, this is something we did and we'd love other people to experience this, and trying to give people sort of a toolkit of some sort that can go away to people that they know and people they should interact with, and saying, right, this is something that really enriched my thinking about my research, rather than sort of the emphasis being on the front end. I'm not criticizing ChartEx in particular. I'm just generally having that, I mean, that worry moment about front ends at the moment, the worry moment about interfaces and their role in projecting digital humanities, you know, I phrase, digital research in the arts humanities as this thing that's about sort of interface building just to give you those new shovels.
I think there's a potential gain to be made from this kind of interdisciplinarity, which I'm not sure has been realised yet, which is learning each other's languages and each other's methodologies, so that as a you know, old school medievalist, I came to charters with a particular training in diplomatic and so on about, you know, how you understand a charter, and had to completely throw that away in order to understand what these guys were talking about into when they what's an ontology? All that, you know, what's the first, you know, but actually once I kind of got my head around the kind of difference between what I meant by a formula and what they meant by an ontology, it was a really enriching way of thinking about the charter historically. So I think that potential gains is not specific to particular projects and their outputs, but is through, in a way, I'm just repeating what I said earlier, really, is embedding that kind of interdisciplinary process and sharing of conceptual models into our training, our formal training. And I think that might be a gain rather than a funded project that produces an X, Y, Z. Do you see what I mean? If we can somehow take that forward as a philosophy.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry.
No, I'll let her first and then you can go.
Okay, sorry. Thinking about catalogues and calendars, and as a historian experiencing how documents that are richly catalogued and richly calendared have been privileged in terms of research and kind of public understanding, I appreciate that these kind of projects are looking into processes, but you're still making decisions about which documents and which data sets we are wanting to create access to. So is there a danger then that as we go forward, we're kind of not really realising that we're privileging certain kinds of historical data above others? That means then in 10 years' time, those are the things that historians are going to be working on. There'll be other, for example, documents that haven't got those texts associated with them that are just uncatalogued documents in a box. We haven't quite worked out yet how to get those into text, that those are going to get kind of forgotten almost, and at the privilege of the kind of whizzy technologies that are amazing, but we're kind of not really realising that we're making choices about what's important. That's my question for anyone who wants to.
Just a comment, I suppose that at the National Archives you're right, that the vast majority of our collections are not digitised at all, certainly not transcribed, not even well described in areas. And so inevitably it's much harder to access that material unless you do want to come in and spend your days going through boxes of records. So the work that we're doing relies on the material being digitised and transcribed to a certain extent, and we're really quite limited by that. So I think it's right that we should be aware of that, but it's not something that we're pushing back against that actively.
I think the way that we choose to make content available is based on on-site usage. So when people come in and use records more, they're the ones that we digitise because they're the ones that are more useful. So you do end up with, you know, this kind of weighting of certain content, but it's a bit chicken and egg really. It's like we need to know, we need to know what you guys need to use, and then we can make that available. But if we don't know that, we can't. So yeah, exactly. So I mean, you know, Andrew, who's also from the National Archives, will know there's we're doing a project at the moment to try and catalogue some of our undescribed stuff for this reason. So you're constantly kind of chipping away at this stuff that's there that's not well described, as well as improving access to the stuff that's popular. So you kind of come at it from both ends, and at some point never really, but in like a few hundred years you might meet in the middle. But
Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead. No, go on. Sorry.
Just a very specific question for the TTT team, which is that you said your aim was to create an algorithm or process that would work equally well on records from a range of periods. And I was wondering how successful you've been in that, and whether you found that your process was working as well with records from the 11th century, 13th century, and 19th century.
Okay, so it wasn't the same. So a lot of what we dismiss as pre-processing actually was a huge amount of work to try and get those records into a consistent format, so that we could link them using a very standardized linking process. And that hides a massive amount of work because, as you saw, they don't look the same at the outset. Once we were linking, the biggest difference and difficulty was in surnames, because for modern records, we give far more weight to the surname than we do to any of the other attributes. We don't have to do that, but we get better linking if we do. And for the earlier records, we treat the different attributes relatively equally. That's something that's tunable, so we don't have to rewrite the algorithm to run these different sets of records, but we certainly can't just push them through as is. I don't know at the outset whether we thought it would be possible at all, so I can't tell you whether it was what we expected or not. But the work that we're doing now to take some and make them up, C8, which is an early series, and we'll continue with the World War 1 series, and I think once we've done that we'll have better insights into how much we had to tune them to handle both. It's not really an answer.
I think we've really worked our speakers very hard this evening, and they're certainly entitled to a drink. So if you do have a question, come along with us to the College Arms on Store Street for a drink where we can carry on the seminar discussion there. But before that, please join me in applause and thanking all our speakers. The